everyone. I'm Julianne Shover. Thank you for joining us today, both in the room and online, both in Arizona and in Toronto, I believe. It's wonderful to have you here for this lecture of the Global Asia Forum delivered by Professor Christoph Emmrich. It's a particular pleasure to be able to introduce him to you. For one thing, Christoph is a polyglot galore. I don't know anyone who speaks as many languages as he does, and so I won't even try to enumerate them, but I think it's more than I can count. That's what I've concluded. And so it's not surprising that his work should be equally vastly ranging across the Hindu and Buddhist world. And so may I just say a few things about his work before I turn things over to Professor Emmrich. He's currently working on a book entitled Writing Rights for Newar Girls, Marriage, Mimesis, and Memory in the Kathmandu Valley, about to be published by Brill. It's a work that I have heard him speak about in various iterations. And we are, I think, hearing another chapter of it today. So I'm particularly happy about that. I should also tell you that we met first, we'd been corresponding, but then we met at the University of Toronto when the Theravada Civ project was about to begin in 2010 or so. And it was a room, sorry, to our East Asian colleagues, but it was a room filled with Mahayana and Vajrayana scholars. And then there was this little tiny corner over on the side where the Theravadan folks were chatting, and Christoph was one of us. And so this was the beginning of a wonderful collaboration through the Theravada Civilizations Project that is very likely to continue on at the University of Toronto in the near future. So stay tuned for that. And I'm very grateful that he is willing to look after that scholarly community. So Professor Emmrich's work encompasses both Jain traditions and Theravada traditions, and his dissertation is entitled Die kurze, die lange und die richtige Zeit. Temporale Formen von Welt und Erlösung im Sutta Pitaka, meaning the short, the long, and the right time, the temporal forms of worldliness and redemption in the Sutta Pitaka. Might not be the best English translation, but you forgive me. So he has published widely many articles, and I can only encourage you to look at them on academia.edu, where you will find very interesting array of articles to give you a sense of the broad range of his work. That includes Nepalese Buddhism and Hinduism, Burmese Buddhism, Jainism, Sanskrit, Pali, Prakrit, Newar, Burmese, Mon, and Tamil literatures, ritual philosophy and literature. And with that, welcome. We're so happy to have you here.
Well, I'm very moved. Thank you so much for your lovely introduction, for sharing your memories and reminding me of how long you and I go back, and being allies for our little field, which has become bigger over the years and stronger thanks to your initiative and to Steve Collins and others. Thank you so much for having me here. This is a place I love, and there are memories of that one of our first group's meetings here, which are very, very fond. to me. And I'd like to thank you for inviting me and to have me speak here today. I'd like to thank Arizona State University and the Asia Center and the Global Asia Forum for making place for me to speak. I'd like to thank Thami for all the work and all the wit went into logistics of getting me here. I'd like to thank all those who in front and behind the curtain are making this happen. I'd like to also at this point congratulate Blaine Harsey, on whose committee I was, and for the great success yesterday and graduating. I'm very grateful to have been part of this journey and of the event yesterday. I also chose the topic for my talk today based on the fact that Juliana, you have in your as your the students you supervise is such an amazing range, which actually encompass the range, the scale from Nepal to Burma so beautifully. And I was also thinking of your work and how though centered on Nepal, it brings in these Buddhist Burmese connections very strongly. And let me just move on and move into the things I'd like to talk to you about today, which connect with these interests and ranges and places. And well, thank you for all those who are here today and those online for joining. Thami, Yahmha, Snehi, Chori, and beloved daughter are 4 versions, one Burmese, one Newar, one Nepali, and one English, of an oral account narrated by Dhammawati, then a Burmese novice girl child, Wonder, now a famous Nepalese nun and activist, taken up by the prominent Burmese monk, writer, and translator Rawe Htun, an account turned by him into a novel describing her, Dhammawati's, escape in the 1950s from her home in the Kathmandu Valley to Mawlamyaing on the coast of the Andaman Sea, a book that in Burma would become an inspirational bestseller. As Dhammawati eventually returns to her Nepalese home, the novel follows her in the echoes of its translation. It is rendered from Burmese into Dhammawati's native tongue Newar, then from Newar into Nepali to reach a national, and finally from Nepali to English to reach a global audience. Dhammawati reacts and intervenes in the text and its reception with each translational iteration. The Dhammawati who leaves Nepal as a girl child arrives in Burma as a young woman and returns to Nepal as an activist, ready to change Nepalese Buddhism forever. And that Dhammawati is as much a creation of her primary author and of her translators across various languages as she is a creation of her own, both as a real-life protagonist and as she who intervenes in and drives the ways in which she has been translated. As a directed, close reading across languages and literatures, I want to reflect today with you on the creation and recreation by men of the Buddhist girl child as a trans-age, trans-lingual, trans-modern, trans-Asian literary figure, on women initiating and intervening in that process of transmission and transformation, and on the kind of historical and political trajectories these oral, textual, and performative transactions produce. Excuse me. Rawe Htun is the Burmese author of the novel around which I would like to build my talk. He died a bit over 20 years ago, was born almost exactly 100 years ago in the city of Pangdale, northeast of Pierre, Northern Bago Division. At the age of 9, he joined the Pangdale Nyangdang Chang to become a novice, where he was given the name Tiloka, and eventually completed his basic Pitaka studies at Tendang Monastery in Taunji. By the time of the 6th Council held in Rangoon in 1954-56, he had risen so far that at the age of 30, he was put in charge of being the main coordinator of the translation of the 6th Buddhist Council's redaction of the canon into Burmese. In 1984, he became the abbot of the Mawlamyine or Myoti monastery, from where he oversaw the nationwide regulation of novitiate matters and the redrafting of student examination guidelines. His subsequent move to the Tamasidagu monastery in Pahan, Rangoon district, made him chief supervisor of the Sangha for 5 years. His CV tells us that he held the office of regional Vinayador, supervisor of the monastic law, thrice, and that of national Vinayador 5 times. holding this last powerful post for almost 20 years. Besides these very prestigious positions, Rawe Htun, throughout most of his later years, held posts of director, Uzi, within the Ministry of the Sasana, in the departments for Abhidhamma and Visuddhimagga, and as a supervisor for primary and secondary Pathamabyaya and Pathamaji Pali examinations. He was also advisor, this may interest you, Molong, to the institutions dealing with Burmese mortuary and funerary services. He also headed the disciplinary committee of the Association of Tilashing Apwe, in which he would be in charge of supervising the final drafting of rules for nuns and their nunneries, described so insightfully by Hiroko Kawanami and more recently by Rachel Saroya. His presence on the advisory board of the most influential journals dedicated to both doctrine and practice of the Dhamma, such as Mingala and Nyatariwadi, to name just two, rests on Rawe Htun's recognition as a writer, which goes back to the early literary side of his personality, which he kept alive throughout his impressive career as a monastic administrator. Starting off with poems in Burmese, praising the Arhats, excuse me, he soon came to master the range of Burmese poetic genres, such as Yadu, Tweju, or Leju. His first major literary recognition came early in 1948, when he was 24, in the shape of the silver medal awarded in the first post-independence national poetry writing competition, which was followed in 1958 by the UNESCO Prize for Translation for his Tet Kantala, a Burmese rendition of the Sanskrit play Abhignana Shakuntalam. In 1965, he was awarded by the Literary Society of the Young Men's Buddhist Association the first prize for literary achievement for his study Tilashin Tame, History of the Tilashins, of the nuns in Burma. Yet it is through his biographical works that Rawe Htun's gift of successfully combining the local, the historical, the doctrinal, and the personal gained him his lasting literary fame. His detailed portraits of spiritual leaders, particularly of Lady Sayadaw, but also of Sati Sayadaw, dating from the 1970s, speak of a preoccupation with religious figures as founders of institutions. His most famous works are probably Mingla New, a richly annotated translation of the Mangala Sutta, published in 1952, as well as another biography, Winter Sani, published in 1953, both of which were adopted as school textbooks. 10 years after these two successes, in 1963, he published the novel Thami, Beloved Daughter, around which this talk will revolve. Sorry about the red ink there. It's a slim volume. The plot is told quickly. Ganesh Kumari Sakye is a precocious Nepalese adolescent of 14 years who lives in the city of Lalitpur in Nepal. And as she attends a sermon delivered by a visiting Burmese monk with her mother, gets hooked onto the idea of studying Buddhism in Burma. She convinces her two friends, Shiva Lakshmi and Manohara Devi, to join her on her trip to Mawlamyaing. While both her and her friend's mother are supportive, Ganesh Kumari's father, Harshaman, a wealthy shopkeeper, is against her leaving. So is her eldest brother, Manakaji. Her youngest brother is too small to have any say in this matter. While the father is away and her mother is asleep with her youngest brother, Motikaji, who, as we shall see, will play a larger role in the history of this novel, Ganesh Kumari, a younger supportive brother, her two friends, their mother, and so the three adolescents escape by night, and after a harrowing trip, first by car across non-existent roads and then a brutal trek across the Mahabharat mountain range, reach a checkpost on Nepal's southern border. There, the brother is held back, but the women make it across to India and reach Kushinagar, where they meet up with the Burmese monk Dhammawati, whose sermon had inspired Ganesh Kumari, his Nepalese disciple Buddha Ghosh, and the famous resident Burmese monk Chandramani, who, as an aside, would later assist B.R. Ambedkar in converting to Buddhism. The adolescents shave their heads, don robes, take the 8 precepts, and receive their monastic names. Ganesh Kumari becomes Dhammawati. As her two friends give up and return to Nepal with their mother, Dhammawati sets off with Dhammawuddha to Calcutta. There they wait in vain for the necessary documents to board a steamer to Burma, and finally, with Dhammawati's brother and his father's business associate about to catch up with them, to take them back home, Dhammawati decides to take the land route instead and follow a group of Punjabi traders to a monastery in Assam. There they join a troop of Assamese elephant hunters who, after an arduous trip featuring a tiger, a snake, and a Naga tribe, drop them off on the other side of the border in Mitina. There they unexpectedly fall in the hands of the local Nepalese diaspora, and the Buddha is accused of kidnapping Dhammawati, who ends up in prison. She gets released thanks to a letter from her mother, and Buddha's monastic connections allow her to be flown out to Rangoon, where after another freak night in prison, a powerful Burmese politician arranges for her to finally get to the Kimarama nunnery in Mawlamyaing. There she studies hard for many years, and after passing her Dhammasariya exam, relents to her parents' demand to return to Nepal. Now an adult with scholarly qualifications, she visits them and preaches the Dhamma before returning to Burma to take the prestigious Titadila examination. She is awarded the Dadana Daza Dhammasariya for her accomplishments, which makes her a national celebrity and launches her as a future missionary. The epilogue sees Dhammawati return to Nepal to help bring true Buddhism from Burma to her home country, which embraces her as her family's and Nepal's and Burma's beloved daughter. One of the most striking features of the novel, here are some images, that's a cover of a first edition, that's the inside title page, and here we have, oops. What happened? Don't worry. Thank you. There you go. And that's a more contemporary edition. One of the most striking features of the novel is the variety of the kinds of prose Rawe Htun employs and the effectiveness in the way he switches between them. Sermonizing Dhamma talk passages, elaborating on Buddhist doctrine and recounting Buddhist history, all of them kept sufficiently simple and brief to have the layperson easily follow, alternate with nail-biting descriptions of chases, brief pauses, and rapid departures, poetic, almost caviar-like descriptions of jungles and mountains, striking jump cuts between locations such as Calcutta or Kushinagar or Lalitpur, and dialogues on par with the best modern Burmese novels, vivid as if they were written by a dramatist, reminding us of Rawe Htun's interest in Sanskrit Burmese drama and his translation of the Abhinana Shakuntalam into Burmese. Cliffhangers at the end of the chapter, characteristic of serialized Burmese novels published in magazines, abound. The parallels with the first Burmese novel, James Lajaw's Mawlamyine, written in 1904, an adaptation of Dumas' Count of Monte Cristo, particularly in the escape scenes, are striking. In other words, even if one is forcing oneself to follow the philological method of slow reading, Thamichi is a page-turner. In fact, the most powerful force that drives Thamichi is time. As circumstances are conspiring against the protagonist, plotting at holding her back, the novel draws out the trajectory of her escape. But the powers holding her back are not stationary. They follow her, extending their reach, proliferating, proleptic obstacles. The novel is about a pursuit, about a chase, where speed and making time, making better time than the pursuers is everything. Our protagonist is always barely a few steps ahead of them. But it's not just the grasping forces of the patriarch that suggest that our heroine has no time to waste. Once she's out of his gravitational field, once she vanishes into the jungles of Assam, time turns from that of acceleration to that of slowdown. In a previous movement, if a previous movement could not be fast enough because the speed and reach of her pursuers, now her pace is slowed down and her progress encumbered by natural forces, mountains, vegetation, dangerous animals. Once she enters Burma, she is for a moment held up by a distant and out-of-place distorting mirror of the society she has been fleeing from. But in the second phase, set in the land of her dreams, obstacles are overcome with increasing ease. Only a few chapters are needed to have her navigate and find her feet in Burma that seems so to actively draw her in, embrace her, and emplace her almost instantly. The technique Rawe Htun uses is twofold. Once the heroine is on her way, reference to time, times, and timing are inserted in almost every paragraph, sometimes even more often than that. Food lasts for a month, the checkpost closes at sunset, weather keeps from telling how late it is, someone is not back until tomorrow, something may happen at any moment, something else will take some time, for a week, perhaps by the end of the month, in 2-3 months, not even for a single day, long after dark, a day of wasted effort, time for us to leave, after what seemed like an eternity, and so on and so on, at a frequency which borders the surreal and the obsessive. It is as if the heroine, the author, the readers with them, were constantly checking the time on their iPhones. Yahweh Htun, however, does all this without resorting to a single year, date, or hour, keeping the reader immersed in the immediate, unmediated, next, and how much longer that shapes the time the Dhammawati's drive and allows the reader to be driven along the Dhammawati's line of flight. The second element Yahweh Htun deploys almost as relentlessly is the time-needing alternation of setback and success. These alternate at a truly neck-breaking pace. Often a new hurdle presents itself the very moment the last one has been successfully taken, and sometimes several of these twists and turns are crammed into one short paragraph. Not only is the reader made to wonder how on earth our heroine will get over this next hurdle and what else may go wrong after this one has been taken, the sense of urgency of no time to waste is deftly played against stalling, waiting, and procrastinating, and measured against the relentless counting of days and of some very long and frightening nights. Never, however, does Dhammawati come across as impatient or as hurrying her fellow travelers along. She is the one who makes decisions, suffers setbacks, and finds solutions, or allows others to do so. The author gives her figure space to develop internal monologues in which she reflects on her situation, ponders alternatives, and decides to move into action. The novel's third element, consciously and consistently deployed to slow down the narrative pace of Dhammawati's rush to Burma, is the sermon. They are clustered in chapters covering the 3 adolescents' stay in Kushinagar, the place of their ordination as novices, a sermon by Chandramani on the sorry state of Buddhism in Nepal and on the creation of the nuns' order, Dhammawada's take on the religion of the Naga people, who supposedly were once Buddhists, or sermon-like passages in which Dhammawati reflects on by herself, on why the Buddha did not know borders and nation states, reminds us of Yahweh Htun's own profile as a monastic author, teacher, and administrator, and of the novel as a text that carries not just Buddhist tropes and values, but also genres of discourse. By featuring sermon-like passages, the novel not only slows down, it also demonstrates that it needs to combine the exemplary life as a message with the message as message. The exemplary person needs to be taught as she eventually will teach herself. Authorities and recipients of transmission need to be arranged in hierarchies of training, guidance, and inspiration. And last but not least, the readers themselves need to be instructed. In the very first lines of the novel, we, the readers, are not given a description of the initial setting of the novel, such as place or atmosphere, nor are we given an introduction to its main protagonist. Instead, we are given a sermon. First lines of the poem, of the novel. They ask, translate from the Burmese here, they ask whether Nibbana is a real object, don't they? They may ask that. When asked, he replies that Nirvana is real and true. So if Nirvana is real, what does it look like? Is it round? Is it flat? Does it lead up or go down in steps like spired, grandly ornamented roof terraces or the staircases of a palace? You can ask even more. The truth is that Nirvana is not a physical thing that can be seen. So, because the way we see, how can we know? The Nepalese listeners were very interested in what the monk was preaching, as if they were eager to know more about how to see and know Nirvana. They were waiting for the next sentence, holding their breath, end quote. And the text returns to the sermon, keeps sermonizing, to then again give us one more glimpse at the setting. The monk sometimes preached in Pali, but mostly in Burmese, which is translated into Nepali by a Burmese-speaking Nepalese monk. The subject of Nirvana preached today is the subject that Nepalese listeners want to know the most about, but it seems that the audience is not getting any help from hearing about the subject through translation, end quote. The novel mentions that the monk who is preaching has come all the way from Mawlamyaing, Burma, and then the text returns to Nirvana for a few paragraphs until finally, quote, in the audience, a 13-year-old Nepalese girl, Nibo Mingle, was nodding her head and listening as she understood the profound teachings of Nirvana, the Nepalese girl who would eventually turn and return to Burma. When she was 12 years old, had studied some Buddhist scriptures and Pali from a Theravada Nepalese monk for more than a year. This uncommon girl who has a passion for Dharma was interested in all this, end quote. By choosing this very unnarrative narrative device, Yahweh Htun takes a risk. The reader who's expecting a story about an adolescent may be taken aback by being confronted with doctrinal matters and may wonder whether he is reading the right book. And yes, as soon as we hear about language and as soon as we hear about language and translation, about Nepal and Burma, and finally well into page 2 to encounter Ganesh Kumari, we realize that what we have been reading are the very words that our heroine has been very attentively listening to. That in fact, we are partaking in Ganesh Kumari's thoughts, which are one with the sermon from Burma and in translation, and in her mind through the sermon. Opting for this kind of beginning, Rawe Htun takes us closer to his Dhammawati, closer to his Dhammawati than any external description of hers could take us, and posits her intellectual communion with the Burmese preacher and his words and thoughts as the very causal condition, as the Pisaya, or Pachaya, if you so will, for the drama and inspirational tale that is bound to unfold. A further twist is the choice of the sermon's content. The preacher does not speak of virtue, Shila, or wisdom, Panya, nor of meditation, Samadhi, but of Nirvana. The very first word of the novel, Nirvana, names that which usually comes last, but which is also the goal and the good above all, which is the highest sense, in the highest sense, comes first. The novel begins with the end. And it is that end which the protagonist, who is introduced in a sudden and almost casual way, will pursue till her return to her beginnings at the end of the novel. To return to the importance of genre, the sermon in Thami is not simply an element added on for the education of its readers. It initiates, projects, and accompanies the entire novel. Yet, there are other nods to genre that help Rawe Htun weave the novel and Dhammawati's tale into a thoroughly Buddhist tale. Dhammawati's departure from her home in the middle of the night, replete with a sleeping a smaller brother, her hesitation to bid farewell to her mother, not wanting to wake the baby brother, the car waiting in the street with a faithful charioteer brother at the wheel, and the monsoon rain covering the engine's noises, all that is simply too reminiscent of the Bodhisattva's great departure to be a coincidence. Dhammawati's ordeal in the jungles of Assam recall the austerities Bodhisattva went through before opting for the middle path. The massive networks her wealthy father has at his disposal, the willing and capable agents he's able to deploy to faraway places through telegraph communications and round-trip train tickets to Calcutta, equal the capability of Mara's army. Rawe Htun is careful not to lay it on too thick and to make any overt allusions to these stunning parallels. And yet these are all tropes that have formed Buddhist readers' narrative sensibilities, that they are perfectly effective. That on the other hand, Rawe Htun also does not shy away from grand comparisons. It's shown by the explicit parallel one of the monks in Kushinagar draws between Dhammawati and the Chinese pilgrims, Xuanzang and Faxian, who left their homeland for medieval India to bring a more genuine Buddhism to China. From subtle narrative echoes to magnificent historical identifications, Rawe Htun pulls no punches in making this story that is more than just about an inspired and overly determined runaway Nepalese adolescent. So what is it about? What is the agenda Rawe Htun is pursuing with it? It is safe to say that Rawe Htun caught on to the sensation of the day, the peak performance of a foreign woman student of Buddhism in the fiercely competitive and fiendishly difficult Burmese exam system in the heady aftermath of the 6th Buddhist Council in Rangoon in 1956. To which Burmese Buddhism had positioned itself as a top player of Asian Buddhism, a moment in which the Burmese Sangha and its supporters were increasingly looking at their larger Asian calling and exploring a more consolidated move towards mission, building on a previous wave, a good decade earlier, and which had reached young Ganesh Kumari in Nepal. Viewed in that light, Thami could be read as a piece of missionary propaganda, celebrating the impact Burmese missionaries promised to have in the winning of brilliant young hearts and minds from other parts of Asia, who would in turn carry Burmese Buddhism back to their home countries. The novel celebrates Burma as the land in which to find pure, unadulterated Buddhism, and the Burmese Sangha as the gatekeepers to that tradition. Rawe Htun novelized the Burmese discourse of Burma at the center of the Buddhist world, with a decadent, theistic, casteist, Hinduized Buddhism at its periphery, where Mahayana rules and the knowledge of true Buddhism is hard to come by. Nepal is depicted as having good and supportive mothers interested in Buddhism and exposing their daughters to it, and repressive fathers and elder brothers who tolerate the woman's choices only as long as the daughters do not leave for Burma. The ideal non-Burmese devotees at the periphery of the Burmese galaxy with the greatest influence on the next generation are women. The choice of an adolescent girl child as protagonist fits into that worldview of a gender-specific availability and openness for the cause of Burmese Buddhist mission. It allows for the ambiguity of the stereotype of the more vulnerable, sensitive, and affectively invested child, most in need of patriarchal protection and control, who dares to do what adolescent boys or even men would shirk back from venturing, an effect that can only be attributed to the power and reach of Burmese Buddhism. Rawe Htun's political interest in nuns institutions in Burma at that time, going back to initiatives such as those by the Mingo Zedawon in taking up the cause of the Bhikkhuni Sangha in his commentary on the Milinda Panya, recently studied by Tony Scott, are without doubt another strong reason for choosing to write a portrait of the missionary as a young woman. In what feels like a self-confident Burmese Buddhism inverting the gaze and trying out the dream or nightmare of the emergent Burmese Buddhist metropole colonizing the former British Raj's Buddhist Himalayan vassal state, one may see in the reverse side of the negative depiction of traditional Newar Buddhism in Nepal a hefty dose of exoticism at work with the Burmese writer, for whom it seems important that this heroine comes from a faraway country in which they have some weird kind of Buddhism, and the girls are clever, feisty, and adventurous, stand up to their fathers, and do what any Burmese boy may only dream of doing. With that mix of the unconformist, the superhuman, the gender-bending, and the exotic, Dhammawati as a literary figure, and from the perspective of, say, Western literary criticism, comes to be located somewhere between Pippi Longstockings of the Global South and Kipling's cheroot-puffing Burma girl in the reverse, on the road not to Mandalay, but to Mawlamyaing. The novel's other side is thus that of an alluringly foreign and charmingly ruthless, and from the sedate perspective of an urban Buddhist Burmese readership, highly improbable heroine, reminiscent of the Theris and the Mintamis, an alien familiar only from old stories from legendary and faraway India, who makes it all the way to planet Burma to shake up things just a tiny little bit. Reverse the story, this is a story Rawe Htun may have wanted to tell to youngsters in Burma along the lines of the extraordinary deeds of a Jataka hero like Prince Widandaya or Vesantara. Don't try this at home, but if you try to be a little bit more like her, wouldn't that be great? It is reported that Rawe Htun was flabbergasted when his novel, within just a few years after its publication, went what today we would call viral, both among Tilashin and young women in the larger urban centers of Burma. He had written a bestseller or a best lender that would see multiple reprints and editions, which young women friends would circulate among each other and would become one of the preferred gifts of monastic women teachers to their novices and lay students. We should also not forget that when Rawe Htun's novel came out, Burma was already 1 year into the rule of General Ne Win's Burmese Socialist Program Party, with all other parties banned by law in the days of UNU's Anti-Fascist People's Freedom League government a distant memory. While the oil industry nationalized that very year, and Burma rapidly closing in on itself, readers who at this point still little realized where things were heading relished the image of an expansive Buddhist Burma without borders, with a very Burmese Buddhism, yet devoid of UNU's multilateralist and internationalist rhetoric, and a Nepalese girl with no other place she wanted to come to more desperately than Burma, and with an off-the-charts result in the national exams. What better figure could there have been to spin Burmese Buddhism's generosity and greatness, and the best thing being that it was all, as pre-titles would run today, based on a true story. So where did Rawe Htun get his subject material from? So let's look at some of our, oh gosh, yes, I hope you can, it might not be able to be that, no, like it's white, okay. Dhammawati herself told me that Rawe Htun and she did not talk much. They met once or twice. Instead, Rawe Htun had read a little piece, little more than a bioprofile, titled Niboga Mingle, the girl from Nepal, penned by no one less than the prominent Mawlamyine scholar, teacher, and institution builder, Say Mama Tangtai Sayado Agap Mahapandita Badanta Turiabiwunda, abbot of the prestigious Mawlamyine monastery in Mandalay and prominent participant in the 6th Buddhist Council, a tiny piece published just after the Dhammawati's final success in the national examinations. Turiabiwunda's text was based on a short biographical piece by Do Gunawadi, a fellow nun, good friend, and mentor of the Dhammawati's, who had written this little piece and submitted it to him. It is common practice for mentors of exam candidates to write and submit slightly more elaborate bioprofiles of those students who go forward to take the more prestigious exams. Her text would have been part of Dhammawati's exam file, Dhammawati herself said that she based her version on the many conversations she had had with Dhammawati, who on many occasions had told her sections of her incredible story, which had been made even more vivid by as Dhammawati said, by Dhammawati's extraordinary gift as a narrator. It is clear that in spite of one or two conversations Dhammawati told me she had with Rawe Htun, only some of this fervor or this creativity would have made it past the exam bio blurb and Ture Bewunda's vignette all the way through into Rawe Htun's novel. It is thanks to the author's literary skills probably that he managed to create some of Dhammawati's charisma, maybe less in the description of her and her actions than through the power of his narrative techniques. At this point in the history of Dmitry, we thus have the situation of two senior men with influential positions in the Burmese monastic world who utilize biographical material provided to them about a foreign student by her Burmese woman mentor, with the more literarily inclined of the two men looping back to the witness and protagonist to help her enrich the novel. He then proceeds to writing in record time for it to appear the very year in which Dhammawati returns to Nepal to start her missionary work. This is the first and certainly not the last moment in which Dhammawati intervenes or is asked to allow or allowed to intervene on the story that has begun to be told by others about herself. In Nepal, Dhammawati returns to the Nepal Dhammawati returns to is a dramatically different Nepal from the one she left behind. Her departure happened in 1949 in the heady last years of the authoritarian regime of the prime ministerial Rana family that had ruled Nepal for about a century. Clinging on to power, resisting the winds of change blowing from freshly independent India and crashing spectacularly around the time when Dhammawati was in Calcutta, debating whether to wait for a visa or to venture out to Assam on foot, which is when the royal Shah dynasty replaces the Ranas in Kathmandu and tentatively brings the Nepal Congress into government. By the time Dhammawati returns to Lalitpur in 1963, Nepalese had had their first parliamentary elections and their first elected government, as well as suffered their first coup d'etat by the king, leading to the establishment of the partyless panchayat system run by the royal family. Developments not dissimilar to what Dhammawati would have just experienced in Burma. Not a great fan of the revolution and other forms of organized grassroots upheaval or the rambunctious Nepalese parliamentary system herself, in my conversations with her, Dhammawati regularly reminisced of the ordered days of the pre-1950s of her adolescence under the Rana rule as the days when you could leave open your front door without having to worry before she left Nepal. The next turning of the wheel of the telling of the Dhammawati story by a man occurs when in 1966, a fellow Newar Theravada monk and activist in Nepal called Gyanpurnik, 5 years her junior, goes to Burma for a 4-week stint at Mahasi Sayadaw's Sadhana Yeta, the famous meditation center in Rangoon. There he picks up a copy of Rawe Htun's Dhammachi, translates it into his native Newar, and gets it published 3 years later as Yahmha. Gyanpurnik, who was made the Sanghanayaka of Nepalese Theravada Buddhism Bhikkhu Federation in 2020, after the death of his teacher and predecessor Ashwaghosh, has been, together with Dhammawati, one of the towering figures of late 20th century to early 21st century Nepalese Theravada. Curiously, he had a similar trajectory as Dhammawati, yet not quite. Then, still called Heralal Sakye, he happened to be in the same audience as young Ganesh Kumari when which Rawe Htun evokes at the beginning of his novel. He too headed off to Burma, joining his Newar teacher, Buddha Ghosh, who was planning to complete his studies, and in the same year as Dhammawati, in the winter of 1949. He too waited in vain in Calcutta for a visa and a passage to Burma, but while the by then 15-year-old Dhammawati and her mentor marched off taking the land route, Heralal's teacher was accused of kidnapping the only 11-year-old Heralal, and the two were forced to return to Nepal. At age 18, Heralal and his teacher made another, this time successful attempt, and reached Rangoon while the 6th Council was on its way, where he greatly impressed the assembled crowd, yakking away in Pali, and as a reaction was immediately rushed through novitiation. Gyanpurnik kept returning to Burma, and thanks to his extraordinary language skills, he eventually became the leading translator from Burmese into Newar, funneling Burmese scholarship towards an emerging Nepalese Theravada readership. A particularly important forum for that was the Bauddha Adhyayan Goshti, the Buddhist study circle founded in 1971 by Dhammawati and her community of nuns, and aiming at providing Theravada training for adolescents. They started publishing a journal and later books in both Newar and Nepali, but soon perceived at their own production of literature as being too difficult to understand after getting that kind of feedback. While as a reaction, the group started to focus more on children's literature and on textbooks, and like Dhammawati and another famous monk, Amritananda, moved to publishing almost entirely in Nepali, Yahmha, with his more ethnically self-conscious and Burmese scholastic bent, stuck to writing Newar and to producing more scholarly texts. These diverging trends emerging in the 1970s Nepalese Theravada community are mirrored in Dhammawati's critical remarks on Yahmha's translation. Image here of his translation. And that's the more recent edition. Though she avoids open criticism, her comments reveal that she finds it lacks liveliness and realism, and that it is somewhat distant and detached an account of her early dramatic life. When she speaks of Yahmha's Yahmha, she speaks of it in contrast to the translation of Thami to Nepali, which we'll discuss in a moment. There's, however, more to her reaction, I believe, than she may herself articulate. The fact that Yahmha chose Newar as the target language is in itself something that Dhammawati, a champion of Nepalese Theravada going Nepali, would have found going against her convictions of the choice of language for her missionizing project. As someone from the elite urban business family with connections across Nepal and South Asia, and with a belief that Buddhism is all about the determination to cross borders, her vision for Theravada was on a national scale and beyond. Yahmha's economically humble background, being from Tansen, a Newar outpost 300 kilometers east of Kathmandu, his success at social mobility with his extraordinary Newar skills as entry ticket into the emerging 1960s counterpublic of Newar language activists, and his formidable Burmese as passport to the world of Rangoon monastic scholarship, and his recognition in male-dominated Theravada circles, situated him in a very different, in a certain respect, even more advantageous way vis-a-vis Dhammawati, for whom being on the periphery of Nepalese Burmese male networks represented an uphill battle of another kind. This may take us to the more sensitive issue of who speaks for, more specifically, who speaks to, and even more importantly, who speaks with young, emerging Nepalese Theravada women. A man, again a monk, half a decade her junior, and one who was breathing down her neck in terms of building Theravada Buddhism in Nepal, training the next generation of primarily Theravada men, and prospectively monks, educating the next generation of Theravada readers, telling Nepalese women's adolescents live, her life in the Newar language, her language, to Newar girl children, adolescents, her students, was clearly a less than ideal situation for her. The not so subtle irony that someone was out there representing her, who as a boy had, with the blessing of his family, taken by the hand by his teacher and led to Calcutta, had failed where she had, against all odds, succeeded, cannot have escaped her. Crafty and resourceful as she is, the next necessary step was obvious, but to that in a moment. Let us first take a step back for a brief look at Yahmha's Newar version of Rawe Htun's novel. Yahmha's Yahmha is a shining example of maybe not so much a literary as a literal translation. In a highly sophisticated Newar, most familiar to Lalitpur and Kathmandu Buddhist literati, it follows Rawe Htun's text to the dot, or should one say to the anusvara, betraying an amazing ease with the source text's Burmese. It omits not a single line, faithfully reproduces every paragraph break, finds solutions for every Burmese grammatical form that may not be reproducible in Newar, applies these solutions consistently throughout the whole text, and even manages to capture the elegant, erudite, self-consciously, casually detached style of someone who enjoys the story he tells just as much as the display of his own storytelling skills. Yahmha's version of Beloved Daughter bears all the characteristics of a scholarly monk who looks at its source text with awe, with which a Burmese translator or commentator would look at the Pali of a canonical or commentarial text when compiling a nidaya, a gloss or commentary, or a vattu, translation, which is what Yahmha, the translator of Burmese into Newar, would become famous for in Nepal, helping to build the Theravada Buddhist literature out of translations from the Burmese. Maybe more accurately, we almost hear in Yahmha's translation the simultaneous interpreter at work. who sits at the feet of the visiting monk from Burma and mediates linguistically as the master speaks and as the audience eventually shyly poses their questions. Very rarely he resorts to techniques that resemble commentary, such as when he breaks up Burmese grammatical terms into Newar endings or subclauses, or when he permutates Burmese serial verb forms in analogous verbal chains in Newar. More often, however, he simplifies some of the more Baroque Burmese turns of phrase into a straightforward, almost objectivist, modernist vernacular Newar, just as an interpreter would try to simplify the speaker's flourishes, which may be lost on the non-native speaker to get the message across more directly. Where Rawe Htun surprises with a sudden burst of overly determined attributive embellishments, Gyanpurnik cuts down the recursive cluster to the one or two elements necessary to convey the gist. Dhammawati, whose Burmese is excellent and who unsurprisingly knows Rawe Htun's text better than most readers, could not have but noticed and meant that when she said that Gyanpurnik's text was "Chan Daya Maju," not lively or sparkling. Every day, the faithful and diligent translator who translates, or every way, the faithful and diligent translator who translates everything well aware of his readers' linguistic familiarity, Gyanpurnik renders all the terms that Thami has in Pali and which his readers would be familiar with into Sanskrit. Nibbana, Burmese for Nibbana, becomes Nirvana. Dea, Burmese for Dhamma, becomes Dharma. Parit becomes Paritrana, Bhikkhuni becomes Bhikshuni, retaining in Pali only the names of texts and examinations and for direct quotes from the scriptures. Yahmha echoes the situation described at the beginning of Rawe Htun's novel, which insists right from the start on that journey from Burma to Nepal and or from Nepal to Burma, that it is also, and to a great deal, a linguistic one, a transit through translation. It is as if Gyanpurnik made up for that failed first trip to Burma by translating the story about the most dramatic act of Nepalese Newar-Burmese carryover, translation. As skeptical as Dhammawati may have been of her junior fellow activist's translation, like much of Gyanpurnik's translation work, it set the standard for renderings from Burmese to Newar and has remained a classic that has linguistically shaped the tiny field of Burmese Newar translation till today. More importantly, just like Thami in Burma, in Nepal, Yahmha became a highly charged object, a precious gift. Women would read and who read and owned it would never forget from whom and under which circumstances they had received and read it, intimately shared amongst and connecting young women ready to be inspired. Dhammawati herself, in spite of her reservations, was responsible for having the first edition published by the nunnery founded by her, Dhammawati Vihara, as well as the second edition in 2012, enhanced by an introduction written by herself. For more than 2 decades, from 1969 to 1999, Yahmha was the book through which the small community of Newar readers in Nepal learned about Dhammawati's life. Likely to have been supplemented, as she still does today, by narrative performances by herself when addressing in either Newar, today just under 1 million speakers, or more frequently in Nepali, around 25 million speakers, audiences. Just as all those who know her can confirm, Dhammawati has been a figure larger than life. So Dhammawati's life story from very early on became much bigger than the narrow social linguistic boundaries of Newar, characterized in 2013 by UNESCO as, quote, definitely endangered language. That boundary was breached also in terms of readership when in 1999, Dhammawati's younger brother, Mutikaji Sakye, brought out his Nepali translation of Thami, titled Snehi Chori. To be precise, Mutikaji's was not a translation of Rawe Htun's 1963 Burmese Thami, but instead of Gyanpurnik's 1969 Newar Mawlamyaing. The rationale behind this project was to finally make available Dhammawati's story to a much larger audience. The growing numbers of Newars and non-Newar Nepalis flocking to Theravada monasteries and meditation centers in Nepal in the 1990s, the visible success of Dhammawati, Gyanpurnik and others in supporting education and other social services in a dramatically impoverished country with a failing infrastructure, corrupt bureaucracy and parliamentary system run by a now benignly patronizing and politically stifling royal family and a Nepali-speaking elite, the desperate need for basic schooling among the rural poor and an increased interest in meditation, particularly Vipassana, less among the elites who tended to favor Hinduism or Tibetan Buddhism, but among the middle and lower middle classes, All this helped to create, beyond the need for textbooks and weekend schools and retreats, a demand for inspirational reading. Even if the monastic and donor elites remained mostly Newar, Nepalese Theravada has had long moved beyond being an exclusively urban Newar and Newar-speaking and reading domain. Many socially mobile Newars themselves no longer spoke the language of their mothers and grandmothers, and more non-Newar, non-Nepali speakers had turned, like the Newars, to Nepali as the language of education, business, and the idiom granting access to better paid jobs. On the textual side, the life story of the Dhammawati was largely identified with Gyanpurnik's Yahmha, not with the Burmese original. The fact that it was a translation, and thus, one may say, derivative, mattered little. What was needed was a more accessible version of Gyanpurnik's famous rendering, not a scholarly and philologically sound return to the root text, whose author, language, country lay far away. Most importantly, the project was viewed not as the translation of a text, but as the retelling of a life. And as the retelling of a life of a person among whose key accomplishments may be counted that as a kid she walked to Burma to stand first in the exams there, but who was first and foremost a Nepalese celebrity, doing amazing work in Nepal, whose story was known through her own tellings and through a book published in Nepal and written in Nepal by which nobody could read, and that urgently needed to be translated. Or rather, more pertinently, not a book needed to be translated, the Dhammawati's life needed to be made known, and there was a Nepalese text out there which could easily be used to do that. All there was needed was to find someone who reads Newar and writes Nepali. And that is how the Dhammawati saw it, and which would ensure, who reads Newar and writes Nepali, which would ensure to keep things among Newar, among us Newars, preferably even someone within the family. And that is how Dhammawati saw it. And so it was her brother Mordikaji, the one who in Rawe Htun's novel, The Night of Ganesh Kumari's Escape, is sleeping with his mother and prevents her from bidding farewell to the mother, who got the nod. The most important effect of this decision was that through it, Dhammawati came as close as possible to regaining control of her own narrative in print, short of rewriting her own story herself. If it takes a man to retell her story the way she would like it told to her capacious public, it might as well be her baby brother. Mordikaji, now himself in his early 80s, is a soft-spoken, sweet person who, when asked, tells his sister's story with an understated mumble and a constant twinkle in his eye. He has a great sense of humor and is, of course, utterly devoted to his sister, whom he refers to, nevertheless, as the Dhammawati Ruma. The text remains, that's the color. The text remains close to its Newar source, carrying over the Sanskrit Nepali as is given by Gyanpurnik and adhering particularly close throughout the sermon-like passages, as if his sister had been running over those to make sure Mordikaji got the doctrine and the historiography of Buddhism right. So at a first glance, it indeed looks like a careful and faithful translation. The first big contrast, one notices, however, still in line with the general outreach agenda, is Mordikaji's mellifluous, chatty, and down-to-earth Nepali, in stark contrast to Gyanpurnik's austere literary Newar. This is a text that the average reader can run through pretty comfortably, or that read out has almost a conversational tone. It contrasts not only with Gyanpurnik's translationese Newar, but also, if not more dramatically, with the more high literary Nepali of prose writers, famous Nepali prose writers such as Madhav Prasad Dhimire or Khagendra Sangraula, and that of bilingual authors writing in Nepali such as Siddhicharan Shrestha, Parijat, or Indra Bahadur Rai. In other words, this is not the kind of prose that would be noticed by jury members of the Sahitya Academy, and one that cannot be compared to Rawe Htun's carefully simplified literary style. Yet it tells the story in a very effective way, certainly for a Nepalese audience, who is not looking for a literary masterpiece, but for a story told with heart and panache by a brother about his beloved and admired sister. The first major intervention by Mordikaji is to have changed the chapter titles. Where Rawe Htun and Gyanpurnik have shared this predisposition for chapter 1, Mordikaji puts girl in distress. Where Rawe Htun and Gyanpurnik have 3 friends for chapter 3, Mordikaji decides for firm resolution. Where Rawe Htun and Gyanpurnik have mummy and daddy for chapter 3, Mordikaji expands to mothers and fathers' love. Where Rawe Htun and Gyanpurnik have the poetical only if he can fly, he will be free, Mordikaji cuts it down to pursuit. Where Rawe Htun and Gyanpurnik have simply snake, tiger, as chapter titles, Mutikaji elaborates to make it an encounter with a snake, and for a Theravada tale, somewhat daring, a night with a tiger. Finally, where Rawe Htun and Gyalpurnik end their versions with the somewhat grandly titled chapter, The Time to Wear the Flower of Victory, or Gyalpurnik, The Day of Tying the Victory Garland, respectively, Mutikaji goes Udeshya Prapti, mission accomplished. You may get a sense where this is going. That Mutikaji's translation may not only be about adding some spice to the tale, emerges in the decision to rename the chapter 5, which in Rawe Htun Gyalpurnik is casually called Runaway Girls, to the much more well-behaved, if not somewhat grandiose, Yatra Ramba, beginning of the journey. Both brother and sister may have had some reservations about back-translating the heroic departure of the renouncer from the paternal palace, the way the Dhammawati's legendary breakout had become to be memorialized in Nepal over the decades, as the impulsive behavior of some runaway girl misbehaved teenagers. Mutikaji did this at the cost of jettisoning Rawe Htun's ironic tone and his not too subtle nod to the wild side of teenage Ganesh Kumari. Another set of interventions of Mutikaji's worth mentioning are what look like factual corrections, where Gyalpurnik follows Rawe Htun, and who is to blame him, in stating that Ganesh Kumari was 13 when she heard the Nibbana talk and 12 when she started learning Pali. Mutikaji changes the literary figure, who happens to be his sister's age at the time of the sermon, to 40, and the age when she supposedly had started to learn Pali to, quote, from an early age, Galileo Umayadheki. Factual corrections. Did learning Pali at 12 sound too late for a child prodigy? Another interesting difference lies in the passages dealing with Dhammawati's encounter with the Nepalese diaspora in Burma, where the critical tone found in Thami and Yahmha is softened in the Nepali version. As these are all instances in which, at the crucial time, the real Mutikaji of the story or of the history was either still an actual baby or simply not around to know better than his sources, there's no question that these interventions would have been made by Dhammawati herself. There are other passages which resonate more with Dhammawati telling me that she particularly appreciated the personal touch her brother gave to Snehi Chori. Passages which are not found in the source text, detailing events unfolding back in Lalitpur, particularly in the scenes at home before the Dhammawati's first return to Nepal, and Mutikaji seeing what seems a stranger nun getting out of a car in front of the house and running up to tell his mother, in fact, quite striking scene that works very well in the book and may have indeed been made more vivid thanks to Mutikaji's input, writing himself and his devotion to Dhammawati into the translation, as he makes up for having unknowingly been the cause that Ganesh Kumari did not say farewell to her mother by, unbeknownst to himself, leading his sister back to their mother. Between Dhammawati's own interventions and her approving her brothers, as much as these decisions can at all be traced in the text and between the lines of its latest translator's comments, Snehi Chori represents in a way the definitive and final, one should add, the authorized, if not biography of Dhammawati, at least Nepalese version of Thami. While Yahmha remained in the hands of the male Newar translator, who himself, in the fidelity of his translation, anchored his work in the authority of the male novel's author, the true repatriation, or should one say depatriation or rematriation of the work and reappropriation of Dhammawati's life story by herself, could only occur once the text was retrieved by her and handed over to the least patriarchally empowered member of her family, a family vis-a-vis she had by now secured the greatest possible authority. It was only through her brother that she could allow the text which had originated with her and her friend and mentor Gunawati to be as much about herself as possible and to be permeated by a devotion and an authenticity that was no longer controlled and mediated by the Burmese examination system or by a Burmese novelist monk and his Newar extensions, but was facilitated by the institutions she had meanwhile built in the community she had gathered around herself in Nepal, and the support from her family she had rejected and regained in order to have her life cautiously rewritten and rewritten on her own terms. Can what Mutikaji and his sister have done still be called translation? Answering that question may not be the most interesting of tasks. It is certainly stretching the pedestrian definition of translation. And I would say that how that stretching happens and what it does and how it helps us understand writing, repeating, changing, and remaining the same within processes of transmission might be a more interesting set of questions. What can come after this? Is it time for an academic or popular biography of Dhammawati as a text that is not another version of Thami? Let me find a coda of sorts to this talk, which is still very much part of the story of Ganesh Kumari becoming Dhammawati. And that shows how the text continues, albeit elsewhere, that the life of the text continues, albeit elsewhere, with some new protagonists and a constant one, whom the story of those who decide to tell it again seem not to be able to let go of. I'm talking about the currently last and most recent translation of Thami, the English translation, or should I say version, titled Beloved Daughter. Beloved Daughter, bearing that title, lays the claim to indeed be a translation of Thami, or maybe rather, as we shall see, if only tacitly ambiguously so, of Snehi Chori, thereby 3 handshakes away from Rawe Htun's Thami. Sometime in 2014, language teacher, occasional administrator for international projects, and former student, current devotee of Dhammawati's, Geeta Manandar, reached out to US anthropologist Ellen Kuhn when working in Kathmandu, and showed her a translation she had done into English of not Rawe Htun's Thami, not Gyan Purnik's Yahmha, but of, yes, Motikaji's Snehi Chori, asking Ellen whether she knew anybody who could publish it. Ellen was hesitant as she found the English to be not quite where she felt it should be for her to recommend the manuscript to a publisher. So she sat down with Geeta and went over a few pages to show her how she, Ellen, who can speak Nepali, would translate it. In the process, she would ask Geeta to explain passages of the Nepali source text to her that underlay some of the translations that were not entirely clear to Ellen. They did not get very far. But Ellen nevertheless sent Geeta's manuscript to her acquaintance, Francis Klatzel, an Alberta native resident in Kathmandu, who had done some volunteer work to help establish national parks in the Himalayas and who was running a small publishing house, Made Up Publications. Made Up Publications, which besides print materials for foreign NGOs, also did books. Klatzel too found that the manuscript required much more work for it to be publishable, so she asked a fellow NGO manager, Pam Ross, to go over the English, and when Pam Ross gave up, took it upon herself to do the job. Being, as she admits, a Nepali speaker but not literate in Nepali, she had passages of the text read out to her by a native speaker, colleague, and changed the English as she went along. But running a publishing house and soon facing 2 earthquakes and a blockade made her decide to contact freshly retired Harvard affiliate, anthropologist, and development studies scholar Sarah Levine, co-author with David Gellner of the 2005 standard work on Nepalese Theravada, Rebuilding Buddhism, and author of several smaller pieces on Dhammawati. Levine enthusiastically took over herself to go over Geeta's translation, and after a quick glance, asked Klatzel, quote, "Do you mind if I just read it and write it?" Levine got her version back to Klatzel in 2 weeks. In Levine's own words, quote, she had, quote, reduced some passages a bit, and quote, simplified some chapter headings, end quote, had, quote, eliminated a few words that would mean nothing to someone who did not know Nepali, end quote, had added a few footnotes, mostly on general matters dealing with Buddhism. Some of Levine's suggestions, like footnotes and pondering a glossary, are in the vein of giving the book a more academically curated shape. More interesting is the, quote, elimination of a few words, end quote. The, quote, reduced some passages a bit may give one to think the most. In fact, if one compares Motikaji's original Nepali with Levine's read it and write it version more closely, one realizes that Levine may have read Geeta's translation, but what she and the publisher ended up with was a text that had been quite thoroughly transformed. Let me read you out a passage from Motikaji and Levine in contrast. I would translate Motikaji's Nepali version literally as follows. Quote, after the first wave of joy and surprise had died down, she, Dhammawati's mother, addressed her daughter respectfully as she was now a great nun. You arrived so suddenly without prior notice. I had not expected that you would come like this. Did you not receive the telegram sent by your father asking you to inform him after your plans were confirmed? Why did you arrive so suddenly? It must have been cumbersome for you coming on your own from the airport. You did not know how this new house looked. You must have had trouble finding the house. Poor thing, or as it was said in the original, Levine renders the same paragraph as follows. The same paragraph as follows. To give her daughter, transformed from a high-spirited girl of 14 to a composed nun of 22, respect that was her due, Hidetaka said in a voice full of deference, you ought to have sent word you were coming today. Had we known the time of your plane arrival, we would have gone to the airport to welcome you and escort you home. I'm very sorry you were put to so much trouble. After collecting your luggage, you had to take a taxi to this new place all on your own. End quote. Levine's text, paradigmatic for the entire English version, reads very well, maybe too well, but it's certainly not Mutikaji's text, and it's clearly not a translation but a retelling. Levine's text reads smoothly, and although she also adds new content, it reads as if told in haste, dropping the convoluted staccato of hesitation, excitement, irritation, and worry that characterize the passages from the original just quoted, and which are so typical of Nepali, Newar, but also Burmese prose in conveying drama. The cumbersome is part of the style of the original, not a fault of Gita's translation that needs to be ironed out. And so are details carried over all the way from Rawe Htun's version that had maybe not only deemed unnecessary, but had obviously irritated the Western readers of Gita's translation, such as the fact in the last chapter that the cave of the 6th Buddhist Council, in which Dhammawati received the Tadana Dhammasarya, had been inaugurated by the revolutionary government of Burma. Whether by now the revolutionary government of Burma has ended in the dustbin of history or not, Levine's version does not seem to want her readers to know about it. There is no revolutionary government of Burma in Levine's translation. Her erasure goes deep. The Burmese history shining through in this palimpsest of a text is one of its many casualties. If Mutikaji's Snehi Chori turned out to be somewhat longer than Thami and Yahmha, Levine's beloved daughter, which also dropped Rawe Htun's, Janapurni's, Mutikaji's, and Dhammawati's forwards, progressively accumulating in the other versions, ended up being the shortest version of them all. Instead, Francis Clatzel asked the American Tibetan Buddhist nun and Sakyadhita activist Kamalek Shitsurmo, who has a considerable recognition value among Anglophone Buddhists, to write a short preface. Clatzel herself added a little miniature biographical sketch of Dhammawati of her own, as she told me, to let people know why the story of a little Nepalese girl may at all matter. Motivated by the same concern, Clatzel also intervened in the beginning of the first chapter. Instead of sticking with Thami and its previous translations by starting with the voice of the monk reflecting on Nibbana, Clatzel takes paragraph number 10, makes it slightly rewritten paragraph number 1, and has the novel start with, quote, they may ask whether Nibbana is a real, start not with, they may ask whether Nibbana is a real object, but start with, 14-year-old Ganesh Kumari was listening intently to the Burmese monk. It was 1949. What Beloved Daughter has in common with Mutikaji's version is that it is not primarily about translating a novel. It is about telling a story. But while Mutikaji was actually still translating, while trying to tell more of a story, which with a story that would enliven his translation, Beloved Daughter, the English version, departs from its predecessors by no longer even wanting to be a translation in the technical sense, faithful to its original. Beloved Daughter has shifted from dealing with the text as a text to primarily dealing with a figure, a plot, and the message that both may allow to convey. The message is that of the empowered girl. The message is that of girl power, an idea so very cutting edge in 1910's Anglophone world. Beloved Daughter came out in 2016, and that by now feels to some of us so very 2010s. The young women intellectuals today, in fact, look back at that time as the heyday of what they now sarcastically call the corporate girlie, who has traveled with all their hopes and disappointments from Hillary Clinton and Malala via Angela Merkel and Greta Thunberg to Sanna Marin and Jacinda Ardern, and with a late semi-satirical refraction in Greta Gerwig's Barbie. If Rawe Htun's Dhammawati was the girl from Nepal, if Janapurni's Dhammawati was the one who got away and came back, and if Mutikaji's Dhammawati was my great and beloved sister, the Dhammawati of Beloved Daughter is the girl boss. The girl boss, who was at the very most expected to walk like a boy, is the adopted child of a faded global Anglophone era in which Western feminist projections of empowerment onto the gendered South Asian subaltern were still untroubled by terms like trans, race, intersectionality, and appropriation. It is striking that while Dhammawati, though dispossessed of the master narrative, had intervened, and incrementally so, in every single previous iteration of her story, in Beloved Daughter, apart from a few meaningful visits to her by those who contributed to the book, her direct influence is the weakest. Even her students' English translation, and with it, as we have seen, the material Dhammawati herself had worked on with her brother, underwent a dramatic rewrite by the hands of someone who had studied her life and published on her. The other striking feature of Beloved Daughter is that, different from all previous versions, the book on its cover of the title page mentions no author, and more importantly, no translator. Gita Mananda is mentioned in the final acknowledgement paragraph, together with all the others that contributed to the final product. To present the book without a translator may be a reflection of the fact that the translator and the project of translation itself was lost, so to speak, in translation. And in the collective nature of the project, we may perceive echoes of the Hillary Clinton-esque "it takes a village," even if in that village, the writing of some ended up being read more than that of others, and its assemblage may have been caused more by breakdowns than by consensus. What is important to highlight, however, is that for the first time, the project of telling Dhammawati's life was entirely in the hands of women. And maybe more importantly, that it was a South Asian woman, Gita Mananda, without whose work and initiative, the latest installment of Thami would not have come to be. Thank you.
Oh. Thank you for taking us on this journey.
Yes.
We're going to open it up to comments and questions.
I'm just kind of blown away by the kind of complexity of the dynamics of like the Theravada missionizing project in Nepal, right? The kinds of just even within the just translation of this story. And I think that's what you know really struck out to me is this process of rendering Theravada legible, or the story of Theravada legible in Nepal, but then also for Newars, but also then for Nepalese, and what is that? I think it's just very compelling.
I have a question, more on the translation, the ethics of translation. I mean, and where did you start? And this is like, I think even from the beginning, right? Rawe Htun, I don't think he talked to her directly. I don't think, right?
I met briefly. Yeah.
Right. So, and then for him to just write, I don't know if he even got permission or not, without her actual input, it's just, you know, if you think about it, it's violating, it's violent in many ways. And the same thing with, you know, these consecutive translation. And I mean, I don't know about, I don't know how I feel about the latest, the English translation, but so I just wanted to see how, as you're, you know, going through the story, what was your, I guess, what's your take on like this kind of work and this kind of translation, and then the ethical issues behind it?
I think you're putting a finger right in that. I think which for me is the most important issue actually about this story, and which is I think so important because it also speaks to us today who are reviewing this history, right? I think this is a question somewhere which is only, I don't know when to say which is only possible today, but it's asked from today, right?
Yes,
And
yes.
while I also think that there's been the disquieting and let's call it the suffering of wait a minute, who are these people doing this and telling my story throughout, right?
Yes.
And but that there was no way to articulate it the way we would articulate it today, and to say wait a minute, right? And to have to have the intellectual and theoretical and ethical toolbox and repertoire to do so, right?
Yes.
Where the only way to do it was, and I think that's and I could have elaborated that a bit more. The only way to do so was actually Dhammawati's attempts at getting some control over this process, right?
Yeah.
Whether she was actually then eventually the editor, or was she initially the editor of the Newar translation, and then writing the preface. And then finally, actually taking in some way, that's an interesting relationship with her and her brother, right? How that really worked out, one will never find out really. But basically, all these moves is actually already articulating that unease and more than unease, that protest, if you so will, right? And right up to the last, I've just been, the last part is something which I've discovered, very recently, and I'm also I must say, very grateful to those who have, to that village which it took to make that book, the participants and the contributors to actually sharing with me all these processes and allowing me to look into them with my, with that balance of surprise, to put it mildly, and gratefulness that they're in some way contributing in allowing us to understand the process and all its complicated nature, right? Yeah, I could go on, but
Thank you.
I'm sorry.
Oh, sorry. Thank you for this talk. I just was looking at the timeline, and I wonder, why did it take so long from 1969 then for Dhammawati to sort of try to intervene through her brother Motikaji?
Yeah, why it takes so long? That's a great question. Yeah, I think it took so long because of, actually, I think I should draw that connection more strongly, but I actually understand it only now better through your question. The shift in the language shift, the fact that Theravada, the Theravada movement became a Nepali movement.
Right.
And then it moved away from the small, because relatively small Newar community. So first of all, there was an opportunity to redo things, right? And even a demand to do something new, to not keep reproducing the Newar version, which had become sort of canonical.
Right.
And so it's difficult to displace. I mean, it would have been difficult for her well, first of all, right in the aftermath of the Newar version, there would not have been the audience yet, right?
Yeah.
So the audience had to be built by her. Right, by her activism and by her building a new generation of young readers,
Right.
who would then mostly be reading in Nepali or wanting to read Nepali because they were themselves socially mobile, social mobility, which was encouraged and produced by her own, by Dhammawati's own work, right? Exactly, as well as by the larger economic and political developments. So I think that's probably that would probably be maybe the main reason. Yeah, and the demand. I think again that's something one could maybe I should explore a bit further. I know that and I mentioned that briefly, that there's been the oral side of it as well, right? The book was out, but then there was she, a big speaker, a great Dhamma talker, who would then always weave her story into her sermons, right? So and speaking Nepali mostly, then in that process, right, of larger audiences in Nepali. So I'm in some way, I think the story was developing in her, and then also probably took that time.
Right. And are there recordings available of her sermons?
Oh yeah, lots of them. Yeah. Oh, she's huge. She's huge in Nepal, and she's huge in Burma. That's the other thing. So that is, another aspect of. I don't go into her actual, the real Dhammawati in some way, who's not the redactor or co-translator. So that's a whole other story. That was the moment where I said someone should be writing now. A biography. Particularly, and that would again connect globally, or in a global Asia and trans-Asian sense, how big she is in Burma. That is just every time I travel there, and I say that I also work in Nepal and I know her, and so it goes like one handshake away from or one Anjali away from Dhammawati, basically. And so that interconnectedness and her presence I mean, this narrative is more like her going away, right, and shifting away from the Burmese. But her presence in the Burmese is still something I find impressive.
Thank you.
This was fascinating. Thank you so much. And my question, if it is a question, basically comes out of my complete ignorance of everything. I learned a lot from this. But again, my field is pre-modern East Asian literature. So I think it kind of relates to Chan's question about translation. And I think the basic thing I want to ask about is how you see Theravada ideas about language relating to this kind of modern case study of which involves, more contemporary ideas of what translational fidelity is. And the reason I ask this is, as an East Asian, I study pre-modern Japanese literature. There's a long-standing discourse of fictionality, translation, in which all of these different distinctions between a faithful translation, a retelling, an adaptation was just absolutely meaningless. In pre-modern Japanese, these all bleed into each other with no sense of tension or ethics or anything like that. And the example that's always cited in discourses of fictionality, especially, is Buddhism. They always present Shakyamuni as the inventor of fiction because he had this idea of upaya, where at least in the representations I'm reading, you can twist things, you can bend things, you can tell little white lies as long as it's allegedly in the service of some kind of larger truth, and it rarely is. But that's at least kind of the rhetorical camouflage you give to fiction. And again, I don't know if this is a question, but I'm wondering if, as a 21st century scholar, I see all the complications and political tensions and problematic aspects of this history of translation. In terms of seeing things from the 17th century Japanese perspective, it seems like this is a very common approach to translation, where you have a point you want to make, and sure, you twist things around, you rely on hearsay, you kind of cut some corners, but as long as that larger truth gets across, it's really not seen as problematic. So I guess again, how do contemporary ideas about fidelity, translation ethics relate to, I hate the word traditional, but more traditional Theravada understandings of the relationship between language and truth?
Yeah, a wonderful comment, and wonderful questions in the comment. Gosh, huge. Yes, I like your suggestion to see basically the two directions, or the chiastic structure of reading it from a modernist or from a pre-modern perspective. I think that's really good, because I was trying to say earlier that in some way, the way I'm telling the stories, I'm telling it from backwards in a way, right? And trying to identify moments of resistance, of assertion, self-assertion, self-reinscribing and reappropriation and so on, which I think on the ethical side would tend more towards towards the modernist and towards the positionality kind of reading. While the other striking aspect is that in my conversations with her, with Dhammawati, she never made that point. They made that ethical point, right? So the ethics of it never didn't have any place. It was all about, I'm doing this, and this is a good idea. I do this next, and that was the situation. I was dealing with it, and in some way also a huge sense of pride that my story is being told and retold, and that I'm now helping others tell it. Also that sense of enabling and facilitating, which would be maybe more the kind of ethical element you would find also on the Buddhist side. Also, the tension of modesty and humility, and at the same time being the person who has to change the world, right? I would definitely see that in the transmission and in the retranslation, what you're saying about the pre-modern, of not seeing conflicts between one or the other, or not seeing drawing the lines between retelling and translation. Absolutely. I would not say that there's no awareness for that one is doing one or the other at certain points, or doing more of one or more of the other. I would say that the tensions and the hesitations which would emerge with the ethical or with the more modernist would be, and the author as the author and so on, authorship would then be introduced into the conversation. But for example, the awareness that you're actually doing a translation or doing a commentary of sorts or doing a retelling, I think those you could probably identify. I mean, that you would have, and you would see, I think that particularly in the transition from the, say, yeah, the different moments, right? I mean, also the genres, right? I mean, for example, the Newar translation, the first translation in Nepal, he would be, and that's the translator's environment, he would do commentary. He would have a very strict and very strong Pali, coming back to the language question, Pali Burmese training, and he would be also a simultaneous interpreter. So he'd be very clear what he's doing when, and he would see this as I mean, in the Pali Burmese sense as a watu, as a translation. Yeah, he would be very clear that he says in his introduction, this is not a commentary, and I'm not telling a story. I'm giving what the Burmese monk is giving us. That is different again with when I think you also mentioned that in the early days when Rawe Htun is doing his story. There, he is the poet also, right? He is the modern novelist, right? Who is some way doing his research and doing also. I mean, I could have gone a bit more into his writing background because he's this amazing author who writes in all kinds of genres, and a large part of his oeuvre are local histories of sacred sites. But they're also, for example, histories or biographies of great religious leaders. So there's always a kind of a documentary, historiographical side in it, and an almost historical novel kind of side to his writing. But then also very clear that he's not doing research here, right? That he is embellishing, and he's writing another Burmese Shakuntala story in a way. Too, right? So, yeah, I would say it really depends. I mean, there are these two movements and these two ways to read, but then there are also smaller moments which are specific and where authors make specific decisions on the basis of how they see themselves as authors.
Thank you. This is really rich, fascinating. Thank you.
I just have a quick addition onto the translation question. You said that Levine's English version has footnotes related to Buddhism, right? And so if we can think about, this might be, questions of translation about a person's life, but also there's this retranslation of Buddhism going on too, right? And I'm interested about that, from the Burmese to the Newar, and then to a community that's already embedded in certain forms of Buddhism, to the kind of broader Nepalese community who has some kind of sense that there are Buddhists around them, but maybe not Buddhists themselves, to a kind of English version that has kind of maybe potentially no engagement with Buddhism, right?
Yeah.
So can you speak to that a little bit, what you found in that kind of translation of Buddhism?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, that's something one definitely can unpack much more. The original text has this very strong missionary ethics or impetus or agenda, right? And that's something which the expat curators have had to deal with, and it's not easy to deal with. You can't, in some way, you can't. I mean, I think there was, when I say it, there was hesitation to write an anti-Mahayana pamphlet or propaganda piece or novel, right? Because particularly once you bring in a scholar who then has to take herself out of it and put the distancing with the footnotes and so on, interrupts that. And how much of the text then is still works, right? It doesn't anymore work anymore. Particularly in the relationship of how do we depict Nepalese Buddhism and how do we depict Theravada Buddhism, and not just that that we have to deal with the agenda of the text, but that we then also want in some way to do a different text, not just de-missionarize it, but also turn it somewhat into an academic project, also, right? Which tells us about Buddhism, whatever that, from which, whatever that, well, tells about Buddhism from the perspective of North American Buddhist studies, right? And then it becomes a very different text. I mean, you get, I mean, the kind of documentation, they were discussing, should we add a glossary? Then it gets, even to be more academic. Then you get photos added, and you get then a preface by Kamal Lecture Tsomo, so you get a whole different kind of missionarizing then moved in, and then you have it by a Tibetan Buddhist white North American nun, who then, how does that work with the Theravada side of things again, right? So it's all about ecumenism and bringing Buddhism together, and then you still have weird, tough moments on, well, Mahayana is just, they're just Hinduized, and it's just also interesting moments, and I think Levine in some comments reacts on the Nagas, for example, where you have a fascinating passage where the monk preaches to Dhammawati, and she asks, so who are these people? And then he says, well, they are very sweet and very kind people. They were all Buddhists at some point, but then, they lost their Buddhism, and, we have to bring it back to them, right? So, I mean, didn't mention that, but the whole kind of mission,
within the
Burmese mission within Burma, right? So it's also an internal mission kind of project here. And then the whole idea, of the tribal and the marginalizing, and but then also the Naga actually as well, you're not quite as quite in that situation in Nepal as the Nagas, though, and they are actually the noble savage, and we can deal with that in a different way than you guys in Nepal, where things are much more messed up and you've got caste and all that.
Thank you.
Hi, Professor, thank you for the talk. I have one comment and one question. My comment is related to Professor Hedberg and Chan's comments. I share quite similar sentiment as Chan, and when I was signing up for the talk, I look at the title, I thought I'm in for a story about a great nun and a child prodigy. But when I first starting to hear about the talk, I was like, wow, this male, who are they? and you mentioned in your talk that feminism was still a subaltern idea in Southeast Asia back then, and that Theravada Buddhism was very male dominant. So I study early modern, late imperial Buddhist art in East Asia. And in the contemporary Buddhist community still, there's this sentiment in East Asia that it's much easier for monks to be hired as ritual masters and get offerings. So I wonder, in reality, in this study, we shine a lot of spotlight on the nun, Dhammawati herself, but in the broader context, how did she fare compared to her male colleagues in Nepal or Burma?
Yeah, fantastic question. I regarding the term feminism, you might have noticed, I bring that up in the last round, right? When we're dealing with white women, extracted women, global feminism, if you will, and the way that project shapes the retelling, right? The term I've been cautious to use it in the earlier moment, though as you rightly noticed, I am interested in, and that's, I think, a really important question. What did Dhammawati, what was she able to do, and under which conditions? How did she create her own conditions, and what was she not able to do, right? So, for example, particularly with the emergence of that first Nepalese Newar translation, I think there I think what becomes clear for her, what becomes clear for the text, is the kind of marginalization. As much as she's been lionized and been celebrated, it is the guys who are writing about her, and it's the guys who are training other guys, and yes, and whether it's in Nepal or in Burma, those hierarchies persist and are transmitted and are repeated. So one thing is say recognition, but recognition of what kind, right? For example, the Theravada monks would get positions eventually in a democratizing Nepal, in parliament, for example. Her allies or her the nuns would not. So on the other hand, she has in some way, she's the nun of the hearts, right? She is the one who's seen as having actually turned Nepal Buddhism, I mean, from the Tibetan perspective, around. She's the big reformer. And the other, the men are regarded as, important, and they get to go to parliament, but they're not the ones who've done it, right? So you get that and the kind of whatever I would say even cult following she has. None of the male monks have that. So in some ways it is an interesting divide between popular support and effective projection and actual political clout, right? And there I would say that they're not on that side. Not much is changing.
Thank you.
I mean, I should throw in maybe the question of bhikkhuni ordination just very briefly, which is something very important here, where Dhammawati then went and got Chinese Buddhist Mahayana ordination as a bhikkhuni, which is she did not get in Burma, she did not get in Nepal, and then came back, and then conversations happening about how does the Theravada side and the Mahayana side relate here if you get a kind of monastic ordination on the Mahayana side. But she's again someone who would then in that Sakyadhita kind of context would say, well, this is all one, and where one is feeding into the other, and we're strengthening Buddhisms, and whatever Buddhisms have to offer, strengthen each other and promote the position and the acceptance and the prestige of nuns.
Can I make some observations, please? Thank you so much. This is so much fun. I really enjoyed it. And I wanted to make a couple of observations, and perhaps you could react to them and see and tell me if you see it in a similar way or not. So to me, the story is one of progressive steps in the process, biographical process. And so I'm thinking about the work of Frank Reynolds and Kath on how the story of a life becomes a hagiography or a sacred biography. What are the steps of making it more abstract, and by what criteria? And the Catholic Church, for example, had some very stringent criteria. You had to have a miracle. And then, the person had to be dead for good. And then there was, first a vernacular biography written, then one in Latin, and then some kind of committee or cremium in Rome would convene to say, this is true, this is not true, and this measures up to being an actual saint or not. And this was called the process of beatification. So anyway, there's something similar at work here, but it works through different institutions. And so the story of the initial story told by the Burmese monk, I find that rather fascinating, because what an escape. He's such an accomplished scholar, so recognized, and yet he writes about a little girl's escapes or escapades. That's pretty something, and off topic, right? In terms of perhaps his monastic practice and so on. So it's a bit of a remove here. On the one hand, he has a status to maintain, but on the other hand, talking about this other stuff, it's not entirely monastic in the traditional sense. And then her own retelling through her brother also maintains these assemblages of status that she obviously has to protect. She's a trailblazer and is trying to invent a role for herself that's not established. And so it's very easy for her to retell her story, or convenient, I should say, through her brother, because it gives her a bit of a remove. It allows her to maintain her status. And so it seems to me that the most recent retelling at Harvard is something like Rome. Yes, Rome.
Nice, yes.
You know, deciding what is the truth here and what is the miracle and what makes and yet it is sort of in Chan's word, a violent inscription on the life of someone who is still alive, right? And so they didn't wait for her to pass and determine the miracle, but it's much more compressed. But I think there is something about a process, a biographical process at work here, how to fashion a saint in a particular time with a particular agenda and particular audiences at different levels. I don't know if you.
Right to your last point. I mean, in some way, the question is, in order to write about or make someone a saint, in some way you have to exclude the saint. I mean, you have to kill the saint. Or the king it has to be dead,
Yeah.
anyway, right?
Erase them.
Exactly.
Real life has to go.
And it's so exactly, and that's what and I think that's a great observation. In some way, that's what's beginning to happen in this last version, which is the version in some way where the protagonist is the least involved and least present, and yet it's most comprehensively about her, but as almost as an object of study or veneration or canonization, right? But the kind of having some way to switch off the life or something, or to drain or take out the life in order to make the image or the saint. I think that's I think that's really important.
Creating a particular kind of status.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. What I left out is the fact that there is, and I've been in conversation with the Sarah Levine passed away, but I've been in conversation with Glatzel, and there's a project of doing the next edition. And I didn't talk about that, but we'll be in another section, another couple of pages. And that's another fascinating part. I think it would be and I'm going to stay on that and we're going to observe what's going to happen there. But Francis already told me what they're planning to do. So it's basically going to be more introduction. And so the framing, the halo is getting more solid in a way. And so what she felt that there was even not in this one, there was not enough motivational or a rationale why we should be regarding her as well, not as a saint. That's not the terminology they're using, but the person she is, and that we need more, somehow more information. There's not enough, and that's I find an interesting bit where that what we have here is not enough. Somewhere, no, we need to supply footnotes, we need to supply another intro to the intro, and not just asking other people necessarily, but for also control, right? We need to control this canonization process even more, right? And also the idea that this has not had enough impact. No, what can we do to make it, to make it even more widely read?
So fascinating, and to get back to one of the earlier points in the story that also resonated a great deal with me, and something that I think has not been sufficiently interrogated in Burmese Buddhism or foregrounded in the study of Burmese Buddhism, is the notion of missionization. Because what everybody does at every juncture in some form or another is Davana Beauty. That's, working on behalf of the dispensation. So it's an inherently missionizing religion.
Yeah, I'm very interested in, and I totally agree that there should be, we should work on that aspect.
I wonder if there are our online guests are still patiently waiting to, comment in.
I think it's just a comment. Smita Kothari said, "Thanks, Christoph, for taking us on this amazing journey of multiple iterations that only a polyglot like you could do justice."
I have one last touch on that. I'm curious if you have any sense of the proliferation of the English version
Mm.
and what that might say, 'cause just intersections with my own work around how the outside world views Nepal as this kind of oasis of, and even the state is cultivating this idea of a kind of spiritual territory, like a spiritual destination, right? The land of the Buddha and these kinds of things, even in its touristic kind of endeavors. And I wonder if this kind of English rendering of her contributes to that in any way, if you have any sense of the proliferation of the English.
Yes, no. Yeah,
Yeah.
simple answer, no. The publisher is a tiny Nepalese publisher, basically an NGO kind of environment publisher. It does not get the distribution, a big kind of US or even Indian publisher would.
Maybe you find it at all the bookstores in Nepal, in
Well,
Kathmandu.
yes, oh yes,
Yeah, yeah.
you would, absolutely, absolutely. So you go to the usual bookstores, English language bookshops, and Vajra books,
Yeah.
Pilgrims, Mandala, well, I don't know now, but you would have found it kind of a year or two ago. But again, that's the place. Then you go there, you browse, you tourist or expat, and then
It's just interesting, it just came to my mind,
Yeah,
it's
exactly.
interesting to think about what that
yeah.
is saying about not just Buddhism, but also Nepal, like Nepal's seat in that conversation.
Right.
Her figure, her position, helping to establish Buddhism in Nepal.
Yeah. No, I would say no, what you would get then is it's an interesting parallel world in which these kind of books circulate. Because they have nothing to do with the majority of the devotees and the whole infrastructure, Nepali infrastructure around Dhammawati. It's completely outside. Yes, there's a book in English kind of thing. Oh someone did a translation kind of thing. That's it, right? And then on the but even I don't know how the question is also the shelf life in bookshops of these books is not very long, right? They're there and then they're gone, and then right. So with the Nepalese state, this basically doesn't even register, right? And it's not used or deployed in any way. But yes, but it's a great question. I mean, that's something I'd like to look at. What about audience reception of this book? Have a look at that.
So I want to follow Dr. Schober's comment on the potential process of canonization and sanctification that is potentially rooted in the larger goal to missionize by protecting, perpetuating Tadana, or even like in the new ways. So was there anything like I mentioned about her special contribution, her role in cultivating Tadana, or a Tadana, as what MK Long recently commented on in her presentation, like how there's a shocking similarity between that and Mingun Seado's contribution, Mingun Seado's own Tadana.
Yes.
If that makes sense, is there anything mentioned about her role in fostering her own Tadana in a brand new place?
Yeah. Well, that's a question whom you interrogate, no? Or where you position yourself in terms of what you want to know and whom do you want to, and what voices here count. I mean, she would say her answer would be no. What my Tadana? I mean, that's no such thing, right? While as a critical tool to say, well, there are different things, there are different agendas, there are different readings. Yes, that might be interesting, but I'm not so sure whether how productive that would be. I mean, just to basically try to tease out what her I mean, whether that would still work in terms of Tadana. I mean, of course, one could look at what's her agenda vis-a-vis Gyan Purnik's agenda, for example, or what's her agenda vis-a-vis Rawe Htун's agenda. Yes, I mean I think that's interesting. That's productive. I mean, that, for example, that her
for example, these decisions of regarding language, right? That and it goes back to your question. What language do we choose, and what relation? How do we define relations between languages and what we're doing? So, for example, her decision to go Nepali and to sort of move out of the Newar ghetto, so to speak, the marginalization of the Newars, would be one part of the way she does things. The other thing, she's not interested in Abhidhamma, for example. Although she's very low, has a very low key interested in theoretical issues. For example, she is an institution builder. She is someone who she's a storyteller. And there, of course, there's Abhidhamma everywhere also in that. But that's different from someone like Yahmha who would say, no, we need to get out introductions to Abhidhamma. We need to get out actually translations from Burma of Burmese texts. So with him, for example, she would be most. I mean, she would be someone who say we have to do things in the Nepali way, right? And maybe that would be Tatana. I don't know. But Yahmha, for example, would be saying no. I'm saying exactly what Mahasi Sayadaw is saying. There's no difference between that and anything else is Sanghabheda, right? I mean, and so so he would react to that, right? So it's interesting to use or the several Tadanas as a critical term, or to see how it works maybe, but also then to see what the pushback would be. I don't know that
What about the possible amplification of her role in
amplification?
Increasing emphasis
Yes.
on her contribution to Buddhism throughout the process of writing and rewriting, translating, reading and rewriting?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that's something I would say there's a certain split in her attitude. I mean, one is, and I think it might even go back to, you might even find it in Rawe Htun's novel. This split. There's on the one hand this grand vision, and the map making, and there's the center here, and then there's the periphery there, and then there's kinds of Buddhism which are more or less good, and then there are the Hindus out there anyway, and and then alliances, and we should the Buddhisms should be allies and vis-a-vis, say, the Hindus, and then there are some rather also dark comments on other religions. So there's that big large mission kind of world making, and then there's I'm sitting down with the Newar girl children and talking, and we're doing things together, and we're having fun, and and I'm going to explain things to them, and those things don't necessarily go together, right? In terms of what is my mission, or what am I doing here, and I would say also there are different interlocutors whom she addresses differently depending on what in which kind of discourse she is in. So say if she were to talk politics, we do some male talk, then it would be usually the first. If she's community building, then it would be the second, right? And they go together and they don't.
All right. Thank you, Professor Emmrich. This was fantastic. And so soon we will see it in print from now.
Yeah. Definitely be an article. Before.
So is the segue or the little episode about the parents trying to recapture her in Calcutta, is that true?
Yeah. Well, that's a good question. Is that true? Yeah. We're dealing with a novel here, but that's the other thing which I don't really address too much. Right? What's the relationship between the telling actually happen? It's become so much. It's so much part of Nepalese or Newar Buddhist or Theravada Buddhist law that it's true, right? Yeah, that's how it was. That's the story of the Buddha, right?
It's a symbolic move.
Yeah, exactly.
Separating from from being a Newari Buddhist.
Definitely, definitely, yeah, exactly, yeah. But yes, but it is, if you talk to people about it, the line, this is what's happening in the story, that's what happened, right? So this, the whole story about, but it's, again, it's so overlaid by the story, by the telling, right? Yeah. But if you, again, sorry, but if you read it, I mean, it's pretty in Rawe Htun's telling, it's and then but also in the other, it's very kind of straightforward, kind of. I mean, it sounds very, it's got this this objectivist thing. I mean, doesn't seem much, in these critical moments. There are other moments when she's in the jungle, and but these moments where there's this beautiful moment where they're in Calcutta, and she has to make that decision, and she doesn't know whether the father has sent the brother and his business associate, and how soon they will be coming, and then she's debating, should they still wait for the visa, and then they're getting information that the visa will come, and then the next information, oh well, it'll take another week, and then she's mulling over what, is this, and then she talks to the Punjabi traders, and then then she stops talking to them because they're guys and they're not really telling her what's going on. Then she talks to their wives and they give her much better picture of what. So these things all sound so much exactly, yeah. But something I didn't mention, and there were passages I left out, is a larger narrative question. Who is talking when? And that's something which I really did not, I had a lot of ideas, but no real conclusion. Because sometimes you get the omniscient narrator, and then it's Rawe Htun, you would think. But then you would think again, how does he know? Because then you get long passages where Dhammawati is thinking, and very elaborate thoughts. And then you think, okay, how would he know? And then you get, and it switches over back to Nepal, for example. And then there's the father discussing with his son. So you have to go to Calcutta now. And again, how would, so there's a lot of that where it's not eyewitness based, right? It's not Dhammawati saying, this is what I was experiencing, but there's more of a dramatizing and happening, which must be constructed
You said that she would tell her story, presumably in the community, right?
Yeah.
Was there, have you heard of conflation between, retelling that story is really interesting, right?
Yeah.
Because is she telling the story that's been written about her, or is she telling the story that her experience?
Yeah, exactly. That's part of that authorial voice story. Exactly. No, not clear. Moving between this and that. I mean, you get story. She tells a story, and then my father back in Kathmandu, he was getting organized and talking to Balakrishna to get a visa, and then to go to Calcutta and getting the ticket and so. Which and again, did she get it from the novel? Because when she was telling it, but again, she went back, right? So she may have already heard the story of what was going on in Nepal when she was back then, and then coming back to Burma and telling it to the Rawe Htun, she may then already have brought in information she had from her family about what was going on elsewhere, and then Rawe Htun brought that in. So I think it circles, it loops.
This idea of remembering and re-remembering, and then how does that impact the story? And it's very fascinating. Yeah.
Amasa Boost. Well, fascinating.
Actually, two more questions, but I know we're way over time. We're
That's
like
all right.
2 hours.
We're already way over time.
Okay.
Keep going.
So the first one is, this was really enjoyable, complex, and rich talk. In terms of contemporary Nepal, would a Dhammawati today still go to Burma? Also, your analysis of girl boss feminism in translation is absolutely fascinating. Does the Nepalese and Burmese following of Dhammawati also incorporate some of the corporate girly ideas, or are these mainly coming to play with Western scholars?
Yeah, great question. Can I ask?
This is Srilata Raman.
Okay, yes. Yeah, tough question. So the second one was girl boss discourse in Nepal and Burma.
Western.
Yeah, question exactly. And the first one was?
Would she still go to Burma
Ah, yeah.
today?
Huh.
I mean, with a Nepali.
Yeah, I know, yeah, exactly. 14-year-old now go to
Yes.
Burma.
Yeah.
Yeah, probably not. But that's too easy. That's too easy. Fascinating question. Yeah, would they go to Burma now? Well, until the coup, they've been going to Burma. They would not be. What does going mean? She would probably not walk with the elephant hunters to go to Burma. She would probably take a flight from Chibuvan to Yangon Airport. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly. Over here. Yeah, there'll be enough money around now, thanks to Dhammawati for sponsoring trips to Burma. And again, yes, there's been a network. So in some ways she established that kind of network, and the others who were doing this around the same time and later. So there has been a regular training of Nepalese nuns in Burma since then, and increasing. And now I don't know what the situation is. I know that at some point there were waves of return. So there were when crisis happened and several instances. I know of Nepalese nuns going back and saying this is not the time to be there. Yeah, I would say the time she left Nepal in the late 40s was a tough time in Nepal. I mean, I tried to point that out a bit with the Rana last days of the Rana regime. Those were terrible times for Buddhism, and so the pressures and the terrible times for anyone actually. And if she's got this romanticized, she keeps telling me this, about what a beautiful and peaceful time it was. Yeah, maybe, but it also wasn't, right? So that urgency is no longer there, I would say. I think the Dhammawati now would go to the Gulf to make money, right? I mean, or they do go to the Gulf and try to and do. I mean, why would we not interested in another fascinating way to tell a story of going away and coming back? Yeah, girl boss. I think it's a Western thing. I mean, I think it's all what Western mean, but I think it's something I would identify in the narrative or in the context of making this book. I wouldn't exclude that a lot of the kind of NGO talk is also something which is part of Nepalese talk as well. And no, sorry, I must take that back. Yes, no, there is girl boss talk, so to speak. Well, not in that terminology, but also among neighbors. I mean, there is another figure I've written on, Chunda Vajracharya, who's a professor at Chibuvan University. She's a Vajrayana Newar, a person who is strongly against the Theravada community, and she says, well, we need to find Vajrayana ways of empowering, and she uses that language. Yeah, so yeah, there are reflections.
There's another question. Mudhusudan Rimal ask, thank you very much for the interesting presentation. I wanted to know about the potential reception of Dhammawati's journey to Burma from the then Buddhist community leaders in Kathmandu Valley. Since the Buddhist community leaders leadership was more male-dominated and the state apparatus of Nepal was Hindu, how could you be able to make the journey to Burma? Thank you very much.
Well, reception, I would say that my answer would be just that Gyanapurnik, that first Nepalese translation. That would be reception, and that would be be telling the story under the conditions of Burmese translation, whatever practices for Nepalese public. But it would not be for. I mean, I wouldn't say that at that stage there would be any Hindu or non-Buddhist readers. There would be actually not even non-Newar readers, obviously. Once it goes Nepali, yes, then it goes even, I would say, beyond the Buddhist, because what you get a lot in these Theravada Nepalese, say, meditation centers are people who are not Buddhist, who have Hindu family priests, but who want to have and even send their kids to these camps or these Theravada camps because they want. My boy, he's just too aggressive and he moves around too much, and I want him to calm down to get some shanti, and so I'm sending him to meditate because then he'll it'll be better, right? So a lot of, and then meditation, middle class, Vipassana, which is not specifically Buddhist and or perceived as not only as Buddhist in those circles. So yeah.
We're really ending it now? Thank you again.